In the world of international crime, there's a name that sends chills down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. He was elusive, he was powerful, and he had a reputation for being untouchable. His name? Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, the man who ran the powerful Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. A criminal empire so vast it extended beyond the borders of Mexico into the United States, Asia, and Europe. But here's the twist. El Mencho's downfall came not from the law, not from a rival cartel, but from a single mistake. And that mistake would cost him everything. El Mencho's story begins, like many of Mexico's most notorious criminals, in the shadows. Born in 1966 in Michoacan, Mexico, he grew up in a world where violence and poverty were a harsh reality. His early years, nothing special, until he joined the infamous Sinaloa cartel. He was just another soldier at first, a grunt in the army of one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico. But El Mencho wasn't content with being a low-level enforcer. He had bigger dreams. He had the ambition, the ruthlessness, and the drive to climb to the top. And he did, quickly. By the 2000s, the Sinaloa cartel was fractured. The kingpins were falling. And in the chaos, El Mencho saw his chance. He broke away and formed his own cartel, the CJNG, a cartel that would go on to terrorize Mexico and challenge the likes of the Sinaloa cartel for dominance. But what made El Mencho so dangerous wasn't just his ability to rise to power. No, it was the way he rose to power. El Mencho was strategic. He was brutal. He knew how to make an impact. While other cartels were tied down by traditional methods, El Mencho was always a step ahead, hiring mercenaries, expanding his territory, and running a sophisticated criminal network that included everything from drug trafficking to money laundering and even kidnapping. He made alliances with other cartels only to betray them when it suited him. He was a mastermind, but he was also deeply paranoid. That paranoia would eventually be his undoing. As the CJNG expanded, so did its reach. By the 2010s, El Mencho had become one of the most wanted men in the world. He was on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list with a $10 million bounty on his head. This wasn't just a Mexican problem anymore. El Mencho's cartel was now a global threat. In fact, El Mencho's cartel became one of the largest producers and distributors of synthetic drugs, especially fentanyl, a deadly opioid. This drug would become the catalyst for thousands of deaths, particularly in the United States. The CJNG controlled it all: production, transport, and distribution, making billions, all while staying just one step ahead of the law. El Mencho became a ghost, rarely seen, but always there, pulling the strings. He avoided capture by shifting locations constantly, using a vast network of safe houses, bribing officials, and staying in touch with his men only through encrypted messages. He was untouchable. But there's something about being on top for too long. When you're that powerful, when you've built an empire from the ground up, it's easy to think you're invincible. El Mencho, he thought he was untouchable, but no one, no matter how powerful, remains untouchable forever. And El Mencho's fall came from a mistake that, well, it wasn't exactly one of his usual moves. You see, El Mencho wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was also a family man. And when you run a cartel as large as his, there's always a target on your family's back. For years, El Mencho kept his family in the shadows, protecting them from the media, from the authorities. But one person, one family member, would become his undoing. El Mencho's son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, also known as El Menchito, was his pride and joy. Ruben was involved in the cartel from a young age, taking on a leadership role in the CJNG. He was the future of the cartel, or so El Mencho thought, but Ruben was reckless. He made enemies. He didn't have the same caution as his father. And that, my friends, is where the story takes a dark turn. You see, El Mencho's mistake wasn't just underestimating his enemies. It wasn't just about the FBI or the Mexican authorities tightening the noose around his neck. No, it was when he made a choice, one that no crime boss, no matter how powerful, can ever afford to make. He let his emotions cloud his judgment. Ruben's arrest, a direct result of his carelessness, was the beginning of the end. El Mencho's empire was built on fear, control, and secrecy. But when you lose the one person who means the most to you, when you lose your own flesh and blood, it changes everything. The arrest of Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez in 2015 triggered a chain of events that El Mencho could not control. His son was a pawn in a game that his father never expected to lose. And that was the first sign of weakness, when El Mencho made his next big mistake. focusing all his attention on getting Ruben back. It became clear. The fearsome cartel leader who had once run his empire with an iron fist was now distracted. He was no longer thinking strategically. He was thinking with his heart. This decision, this fatal mistake, would ultimately lead to his downfall. Because when you're a criminal mastermind like El Mencho, the game isn't just about money or power. It's about control. And once you lose control, it's only a matter of time before it all falls apart. After the arrest of his son, El Mencho went into overdrive. His nerves were frayed, his every move was being watched, and with every passing day, the walls were closing in. The ruthless leader, who had once made calculated moves with military precision, was now distracted, his judgment clouded by personal emotions. And that, folks, is when things started to get really messy. El Mencho had always kept a low profile, almost invisible to the world. He communicated with his men through encrypted messages, changed locations frequently, and rarely stepped out into the public eye. But with Ruben's arrest, he began making errors that would come back to haunt him. In the criminal world, paranoia is your worst enemy. El Mencho began to trust fewer people, shutting himself off from his network. His once sturdy relationships with other cartels began to fracture. His empire, built on blood, betrayal, and calculated alliances, was slowly starting to crumble. You see, when you're running a global criminal enterprise like the CJNG, you don't just fight the law or rival cartels. You fight everyone. And the thing is, no one trusts a man who can't trust himself. While El Mencho was distracted by his son's capture, the heat from both the Mexican government and the United States was becoming unbearable. The US government, who had long considered El Mencho one of their top targets, had begun collaborating more closely with Mexico. A joint operation was launched with the goal of taking down the CJNG and capturing El Mencho. But even with this combined effort, it wasn't just the law that was making his life difficult. No, the CJNG was now facing enemies from within. El Mencho had built his empire on fear, but fear breeds resentment. And while the cartel's soldiers were loyal, some began to question his decisions. Some even began to see El Mencho's family-centered mistakes as weaknesses. The law enforcement pressure was relentless, but it was the internal fracture that began to destabilize El Mencho's control. His empire was no longer invincible, and like a snake with its head cut off, the CJNG was about to lose its most feared leader. This is where things take an even darker turn. El Mencho's paranoia didn't just affect his internal relationships. It led him to make decisions that would ultimately come back to bite him. In his desperation to control everything, he became more erratic, making decisions on a whim and trusting the wrong people. His trusted lieutenant, who had once been loyal to the core, grew tired of El Mencho's increasingly erratic behavior. The fear of losing the cartel's empire, combined with the increasing pressure from law enforcement, made the situation untenable. What did El Mencho do? He leaned too heavily on his inner circle to hold it all together.
Killed powerful cartel boss El Mencho. He was one of the most wanted men in both Mexico and the United States. The US Embassy there said it provided intelligence to Mexican special forces for the operation. El Mencho's killing set off a wave of violence, with cartel members torching cars and gunmen blocking highways in more than half a dozen states in Mexico.
The cartel world operates on a simple principle: control. As soon as you lose control, you lose everything. El Mencho, the once feared kingpin of the CJNG, lost control. But instead of stepping back, regrouping, and strategizing, he did what many desperate leaders do. He became reckless. You see, El Mencho's fatal mistake wasn't just about letting his emotions cloud his judgment. It wasn't even about the betrayal from within his own cartel. His mistake was underestimating his enemies and overestimating his ability to come back from it all. His enemies? They weren't just the law. They weren't just rival cartels. His enemies were time and his own actions catching up with him. The law enforcement and military were closing in fast. His betrayal from within the cartel was now known, and the one thing he tried to avoid, capture, was now an inevitability. But it wasn't the authorities or the cartel rivals that got him in the end. It was a mix of miscalculation, paranoia, and underestimating the shift in power. In the end, El Mencho wasn't caught by the law. He was caught by his own desperation. As El Mencho's empire began to collapse, he had one final chance to escape, one final chance to survive. It was a choice he had to make. Either continue running or stand and fight. At this point, El Mencho was a man on the run. He didn't trust anyone. And even though he had the means to escape, the net was closing in. Law enforcement had been tracking his movements for months, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he'd be cornered. But his final mistake was staying in the same place for too long. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel was no longer the empire it once was. But El Mencho wasn't a coward. He'd built something from nothing, and for him, that meant going down swinging. The question remained, though, how would he be remembered? As the man who couldn't escape his own empire. As the days passed, El Mencho's world grew smaller. The walls that had once seemed like a fortress now felt like a trap, closing in on him with every passing hour. His final days were marked by a strange combination of defiance and desperation. His empire, once a sprawling criminal juggernaut, was crumbling from all sides. Cartel members were either arrested or defected, and his own family was caught in the crossfire. But El Mencho refused to leave. He didn't just have power to lose, he had pride. And for a man like him, pride was the last thing he had left. His decision to remain in Mexico, rather than flee to one of his many hideouts across the world, would be the fatal mistake that sealed his fate. He could have escaped to a country where extradition was impossible, but instead, El Mencho stayed close to the heart of his operations. His empire was his life. Every corner, every deal, every shipment. Leaving it behind was unthinkable. Yet, ironically, it was this attachment to his empire that ultimately led him to his end. The CJNG was losing control over its vast network, but El Mencho still held on to his pride. He had once been the most feared man in the world, and now, like a cornered animal, he was facing the inevitable truth. No matter how many years he'd spent outsmarting his enemies, this time, he had nowhere to run. The CJNG had a large presence in the US, and the loyalty of some cartel members had begun to shift. The long reach of American intelligence agencies and the growing collaboration between Mexico and the US made it harder for El Mencho to operate undetected. His every move was being tracked, from the vehicles he used to the private airstrips he relied on. He thought he had outwitted the authorities at every turn, but his overconfidence had finally started to backfire. The feds weren't just dealing with one person anymore. They were dealing with an entire network of criminals, eager to take El Mencho's place. Rival cartels were waiting for their shot at the throne, hoping that El Mencho's eventual capture or death would give them the opportunity to expand their own influence. But El Mencho was not the kind of man who would go down without a fight. It's often said that the greatest threat comes from within, and El Mencho learned this lesson the hard way. As his enemies closed in, one of El Mencho's most trusted confidants betrayed him. This was not some street-level associate either. No, this was a high-ranking member, someone who knew every detail of El Mencho's operation, every contact, every safe house. His former ally, once loyal to the core, had been compromised, whether through fear or greed, we may never know. What's certain is that the betrayal sealed El Mencho's fate. At the same time, El Mencho's family continued to be a thorn in his side. His son's arrest had been devastating, but the pressure from law enforcement didn't stop there. His wife Maria had been a major figure in the CJNG, handling operations on the financial side of things. She was arrested too. His empire, once protected by layers of deception and misdirection, was now exposed from all angles. Reports from sources close to the cartel describe El Mencho as an intensely paranoid man in his final days. He rarely left his hideout, and when he did, it was only under the cover of darkness. Even though he had the resources to escape, El Mencho didn't trust anyone, especially not the people who were once his closest allies. It's said that when El Mencho was finally cornered by the authorities in 2025, he was unrecognizable, not physically, but mentally. The once feared cartel boss had been reduced to a man on the run, hiding from the very empire he had built. Some say he went down fighting, but others believe he surrendered. Regardless of the circumstances, El Mencho's death marked the end of an era. The CJNG was no longer the juggernaut it once was. His death sent shockwaves through the criminal world, one that would be felt for years to come. His empire was dismantled, but the damage he caused remained, like a scar on the world of organized crime. El Mencho's reign was one of unparalleled violence, betrayal, and ambition. His story is a reminder that power can only last so long before it consumes you. The empire he built crumbled, not from external forces alone, but from his own mistakes. What do you think of El Mencho's downfall? Was it inevitable, or could he have avoided it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest in global crime and history.